The dust of dustwood. Texas had a personality. It was a fine, red grit born from the mesas that stood like silent judges over the sun-scorched plains. It coated everything, a constant, unwelcome guest in a man's throat, in the creases of his eyes, and in the quiet corners of his heart. By the late 1870s, the dust had worked its way deep into the grain of Jack Rowan's life. At 34, he was a man carved from the same tough, unyielding landscape he worked. His small ranch, the Bar R, was pressed right up against the sprawling Whitmore property, a fact that was less a comfort and more a daily reminder of all he wasn't. He was mending a fence line that morning, the sun already a hot brand on the back of his neck. The wire was old, and his hands, calloused and scarred, worked with a familiar economy of motion. Each twist of the pliers was a small victory against decay, against the relentless pull of a land that gave little and took much. The drought had a firm grip on the valley. The creek that marked his boundary with the Whitmore place was nothing more than a pale, stony scar, its memory of water fading with each cloudless day. Hope was a commodity scarcer than rain. Jack's world had shrunk 2 years ago, collapsing to the size of a fresh grave marked by a simple wooden cross. Martha. The name was a phantom on his lips, a hollow ache behind his ribs. The townsfolk of Dustwood had been kind, in their way. They brought pies and offered solemn handshakes. But their sympathy was layered with something else, a fine coating of judgment, like the red dust itself. He was the outsider who had married one of their own, a man with a past he never spoke of, who had come west seeking not fortune, but forgetting. Now he was just the widower on the Rowan place, a man defined by loss. His goals were simple: pared down to the bone, hold the land, pay the bank, and live a life decent enough to honor the woman who had believed in him. He straightened up, his back protesting, and wiped a sleeve across his brow. His gaze drifted across the dry creek bed to the Whitmore ranch. It was a bigger operation, with a 2-story house that looked tired but proud, and barns that sagged with the weight of generations. They were in trouble. Everyone was. But the Whitmore trouble had a name and a shape. It was called Luther Kane. A quarter-mile away, near the skeletal remains of the cottonwood trees that lined the dead creek, Eliza Whitmore knelt in the dirt. At 21, she carried a quiet strength that her delicate features belied. Her hands, though slender, were competent and sure as she ran them down the trembling leg of a foal. The creature was a wisp of a thing, all knobby knees and wide, terrified eyes, its dun coat matted with burrs. He was a stray, a ghost left behind by a herd of wild mustangs spooked by a lightning strike weeks ago. He had been near death when she found him, and though he still shied from most human contact, he tolerated her, more than tolerated. He followed her like a shadow. She called him Little Cowboy. Eliza possessed a gift her family saw as a pleasant, but ultimately useless, pastime. She had a way with animals, a deep, instinctual understanding of their hurts and fears. She knew the properties of herbs that could soothe a colic and the precise pressure that could calm a fevered beast. It was a skill that brought her peace, a small kingdom where she was in control, in the rest of her life. Control was a luxury she did not have. She was the Whitmore's solution, the living, breathing contract designed to save their legacy. Soon, she would marry her cousin, Caleb Whitmore. It was an arrangement born of desperation, a pooling of the family's last resources to fend off the bank and the vulture who held the note. Caleb was not a cruel man, but he was a weak one, and the prospect of their union felt to Eliza like a well-oiled saddle being cinched tight, slowly squeezing the air from her lungs. This marriage was for the land, for the family name. It was not for her. Little Cowboy nudged her arm with his nose, a flicker of trust in his dark eyes. She smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed her face. "You're a warrior, aren't you?" she murmured, stroking his neck. "Don't you fret. I won't let anything happen to you." It was a promise she wasn't sure she could keep for him, let alone for herself. The reins of her own life were held in other hands. Later that day, Jack rode into Dustwood for supplies. The town was a single dusty street flanked by weathered, clapboard buildings. It baked in the afternoon sun, the heat shimmering off the packed earth. The air was thick with the smells of horse, leather, and the faint, greasy scent of frying bacon from the diner. Jack tied his horse, Dusty, to the hitching post in front of the general store and paused, his eyes drawn to the one establishment that seemed to defy the drought's oppressive mood, the Velvet Slipper Saloon. Its bat-wing doors were propped open, and the tinny sound of a poorly played piano spilled out into the street. And leaning against one of the porch posts, watching the town with an air of proprietary calm, was Luther Kane. Kane was a man in his 40s, always impeccably dressed in a black coat and vest, a stark contrast to the sweat-stained denim and worn leather of the local ranchers. He wasn't large, but he occupied more space than his frame suggested. It was in his stillness, the reptilian patience in his eyes. He ran the Velvet Slipper, but his real business was debt. He was the town's shadow banker, offering loans at rates that started as a lifeline and ended as a noose. He had bought the Whitmore's note from the bank in Austin, a move everyone knew was the first step in a slow, methodical takeover. Kane's eyes met Jack's across the street. He gave a slow, deliberate nod and a smile that didn't touch the cold calculation in his gaze. Jack gave a curt nod back and turned toward the store, feeling the man's eyes on his back. Kane was a blight, a sickness that fed on the misfortune of others, and Jack knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that Kane's appetite wouldn't end with the Whitmore land, his own small ranch, with its precious water rights from the spring higher up the mountain, was an obvious next course. Inside the store, the air was cooler, smelling of canvas, coffee beans, and dried apples. Sheriff Hank Boyd was at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee. The sheriff was a man worn smooth by time and disappointment. His face was a roadmap of weary lines, and the silver star pinned to his vest was tarnished, as if it, too, was tired of the effort of shining. "Rowan," Boyd greeted him, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Sheriff." "Heat's not letting up," Boyd stated. "A fact as obvious as the sky." "It never does," Jack replied, gathering a sack of flour and a tin of coffee. "Heard the Whitmores are finally making it official. The girl and Caleb." The sheriff swirled the coffee in his cup, not looking at Jack. "Practical. I suppose. Keep the land in the family." "I suppose," Jack said, his voice tight. He didn't like the way people talked about Eliza Whitmore, as if she were a parcel of land herself, to be traded and signed over. "It's Kane," Boyd said, lowering his voice. "He's squeezing them. He'll get the land one way or another. This marriage is just slowing him down." He finally looked at Jack, his eyes conveying a grim understanding. "You watch your back, son. Your spring is the only thing for miles that hasn't run dry. A man like Kane, he covets water more than gold." The sheriff took a long swallow of coffee. "I do what I can. But this star is just a piece of tin. The only real law out here is the one a man can defend with his own 2 hands. Don't you forget it." Jack paid for his goods and left, the sheriff's words echoing in the oppressive heat. The promise of justice felt as distant and unreliable as a rain cloud. He took the long way back to the ranch, riding along the ridge that overlooked the valley. From up there, he could see his own small homestead, a neat, lonely square of hope against the vastness. And he could see the Whitmore place, its buildings clustered together like a family huddling for warmth. He saw a figure down by the creek bed, a woman in a pale dress, and a small, 4-legged shadow that never left her side. It was Eliza, walking with the foal. Even from this distance, he could see the gentleness in her posture, the patient way she stopped when the little horse stopped. He watched as she led it to a small patch of stubborn green grass near the base of a cottonwood, a spot she must have been saving. He thought of his own hands, thick and clumsy with calluses, good for twisting wire and holding reins, but not for that kind of patient tenderness. He hadn't felt that kind of gentle touch in 2 years. A loneliness, sharp and sudden, pierced through him. It was a dangerous feeling. He had built walls around his heart to keep the memories in and the world out. He had work to do. He had debts to pay. There was no room for anything else. He urged Dusty forward, turning his back on the scene by the creek, the red dust of the trail rising behind him like a curtain. As the sun began to dip below the mesas, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Eliza led Little Cowboy into a small, disused stable near the edge of the Whitmore property. It was close to the fence line she shared with Jack Rowan, a quiet, forgotten place. She had fixed the roof herself and filled a corner with fresh, clean straw. It was the foal's sanctuary, and in a way, it was hers too. She groomed him with a soft brush, her movements slow and rhythmic. The day's heat was finally breaking, and a faint breeze stirred the dust. She thought of Caleb, of the wedding, of the heavy ceremonial dress her mother was sewing. She felt the weight of her family's expectations, of their honor resting on her slender shoulders. She was a good daughter. She would do her duty. But as she ran the brush over the foal's bony back, she thought of the wild mustangs, of their untamed spirit, of the freedom in their thundering hooves. She held the leather reins of Little Cowboy's halter in her hand, feeling the worn, supple texture. Sometimes, she felt that life itself was a set of reins, and she was just holding on, letting herself be led down a path she had not chosen. She leaned her forehead against the foal's warm neck, closing her eyes. The coming night was quiet, but she could feel a tension in the air, a stillness that often came before a storm. The dust hadn't settled yet. It never really did. The quiet of the evening was a liar. A thick, expectant stillness had fallen over the plains, silencing the coyotes and pinning the leaves on the cottonwoods. The sky to the west was a bruised, sickly yellow. Jack Rowan felt it in his bones, a deep-seated instinct honed by years of reading the land. A storm was coming, and it wasn't the kind that brought life-giving rain. It was the kind that brought the red dust, a scouring, blinding fury that could strip a man of his bearings and his hope. He was pushing his small herd of cattle toward the sheltered box canyon on the north end of his property when the first gust hit. A physical blow that staggered his horse and sent a sheet of sand skittering across the hardpan. Inside the small stable near the boundary fence, Eliza Whitmore felt the same change in the air. The pressure dropped, and a low moan began to thread its way through the cracks in the old wood. Little Cowboy was frantic, his eyes rolling white in the dim light. He paced the small enclosure, bumping into the walls, his foal's panic raw and untempered. Eliza spoke to him in a low, soothing voice, her hand never leaving his side, but her words were swallowed by the rising shriek of the wind. She had brought him here thinking it was the safest place, a sturdy shelter against the elements. She had not counted on a storm of this magnitude. The world outside dissolved. The sun vanished, not into darkness, but into a swirling vortex of ochre. The wind howled like a legion of grieving ghosts. It was a physical presence, a malevolent entity that tore at the stable, rattling the door in its frame and driving fine, stinging particles through every joint and seam. The noise was immense, a constant, deafening roar that vibrated through the soles of Eliza's boots. She pressed herself against Little Cowboy, trying to shield him with her own body, her own calm a small, flickering candle against a hurricane. For Jack, the world had shrunk to the space of a few feet. He couldn't see the cattle, could only hear their terrified bellows swallowed by the storm. He was off his horse, leading Dusty by the reins, his head down, one hand clamped over his hat. The sand blasted his skin, finding its way into his mouth and eyes. He was lost, completely disoriented. He stumbled forward, driven by the wind. His only thought to find some kind of break, some wall to put his back against. His foot caught on something and he went down hard. The air knocked from his lungs. He lay there for a moment, the storm trying to bury him. Then his outstretched hand touched rough-hewn wood, a wall. He scrambled along it, half crawling, until he found the corner, and then a door, held shut by a simple wooden latch. He fumbled with it, his fingers numb, and threw his shoulder against the wood. The door flew inward, and he practically fell into the churning, dusty darkness inside. The sound was slightly less overwhelming, but the air was thick with the scent of hay and animal fear. He could make out a shape, a small horse, and then a person. "Who's there?" he shouted over the gale. A voice came back, strained but clear. "Eliza Whitmore, is that you, Mr. Rowan?" He was stunned. Of all the places, of all the people. "Yes, my herd scattered. I was looking for shelter." "The door!" she yelled. "We have to bar it." Together, they wrestled the groaning door shut. Jack found a heavy beam meant to brace it, and they wedged it into place. The roar of the wind was muffled, but the assault of the storm was unabated. The small stable shook, and dust rained down from the rafters. In the gloom, he could just see her outline, her hand resting on the trembling foal. He was acutely aware of her presence, of her being the future Mrs. Caleb Whitmore. Propriety demanded he leave, but survival screamed at him to stay. "I'll take the far wall," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for the shelter." "We are all at the mercy of the wind tonight," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos. He found a pile of straw in the opposite corner, a good 10 feet away from her. He sank down onto it, the exhaustion of the last hour hitting him like a fist. The dust he'd inhaled made his lungs burn. Outside, the world was being remade by the wind. Inside the fragile wooden box, a man and a woman, neighbors who were practically strangers, waited for the fury to pass. He closed his eyes, the sound of the storm a relentless lullaby, and fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep. Morning came with a profound and unnatural silence. The wind was gone. A soft, hazy light filtered through the cracks in the stable walls, illuminating millions of dust motes dancing in the air. The world was blanketed in a fresh layer of fine, red powder. Jack woke first, his body stiff and aching. He sat up slowly, the straw crackling. His first sight was of Eliza, asleep on her side on the opposite pile of straw. She was curled protectively around little Cowboy, who was nestled against her, his head resting near her shoulder. Her hair had come loose from its pins and fell in a soft wave across her face. In the gentle light, stripped of the formalities of the day, she looked younger, more vulnerable. A deep feeling of unease settled in Jack's stomach. This was wrong. Not what happened, but how it would look. The innocence of the situation was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the harsh light of gossip. As if sensing his gaze, Eliza stirred. She opened her eyes, blinking in the dusty light. Her eyes met his across the small space. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was a shared understanding in that silence, an acknowledgement of the strange intimacy of shared survival and the coming complication of the new day. She sat up, pushing the hair from her face, her movements graceful and composed. "The storm has passed," she said, her voice quiet. "It has," he agreed. Before another word could be said, a loud creak came from the main door. The beam was being moved from the outside. Both of them scrambled to their feet as the door swung open, flooding the stable with blinding morning light. Framed in the doorway were 3 figures: Sheriff Hank Boyd, a grim-faced Caleb Whitmore, and one of the Whitmore's senior ranch hands. They stood frozen for a second, their eyes adjusting to the dim interior, taking in the scene. They saw Jack Rowan, his clothes rumpled and coated in dust. They saw Eliza Whitmore, her hair undone, standing beside a pile of straw that had clearly been slept in. They saw the foal, a detail that barely registered against the larger, more scandalous picture. The air crackled with unspoken accusation. Caleb's face, pale under its tan, contorted with a mixture of rage and humiliation. His eyes locked on Jack, ignoring Eliza completely. The ranch hand's jaw went slack, his eyes wide with the promise of a story that would be all over Dustwood by noon. It was Sheriff Boyd who spoke first, his voice carefully neutral, though his eyes were troubled. "Miss Whitmore, Caleb was worried sick, said you weren't in your room." Eliza stepped forward, her chin high, her gaze unflinching. She would not be treated like a guilty party. "The storm came up so quickly. Sheriff, I brought the foal here for safety. The wind was too strong to make it back to the main house." Her voice was calm and level, a stark contrast to the tension in the air. "And Rowan," Caleb spat the name like a curse. "What's he doing here?" Jack stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Eliza, a protective instinct he hadn't realized he possessed. "I was caught in the open with my cattle. Caleb." This was the only shelter I could find. "Nothing happened here. We waited out the storm." He looked at the sheriff. "It's my fault. Hank, I don't know what I should have done. But her being here is on me. I put her in a bad position." Caleb laughed. A short, ugly sound. "A bad position. You spend the night with my intended bride, and you call it a bad position." He took a step forward, his fists clenched. "I ought to kill you where you stand." "That's enough, Caleb," the sheriff said, putting a hand on his arm. But the damage was done. The seed of the story was planted. The truth that two people had independently sought shelter from a deadly storm was already being choked out by the more tantalizing weed of scandal. Eliza looked at her cousin, her eyes filled not with fear, but with a steely disappointment. "Nothing happened. Caleb, if you cannot trust my word, then that is a failing in you, not in me." But Caleb wasn't listening. He was looking at Jack, his pride wounded, his mind already poisoned by the sight before him. He turned and stalked away without another word. The ranch hand gave Jack a final, knowing look before following. The sheriff lingered for a moment, his gaze shifting between Jack and Eliza. He sighed, a weary sound. "This is going to be a mess," he said, more to himself than to them. He tipped his hat to Eliza. "Ma'am." Then he turned and followed the others. Jack and Eliza were left alone in the silent stable, the dust mote still dancing in the column of light from the open door. The quiet that had felt peaceful moments before now felt heavy, suffocating. "I am sorry, Miss Whitmore," Jack said, his voice rough with guilt. "Truly, I never meant for your honor to be compromised." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It was the storm, Mr. Rowan, not you, but I fear the town will not see it that way." She knelt and gathered the foal's lead rope. "I should go." He watched her leave, leading the little horse out into the bright, dust-coated morning. He was left with the profound and terrible knowledge that his simple mistake, the mistake of being seen, had unleashed a storm far more destructive than the one made of wind and sand. He had indebted himself to her in a way that could not be easily repaid. By mid-afternoon, the story had taken root in Dustwood's fertile soil of gossip. In the Velvet Slipper Saloon, the tale was told and retold, each version more lurid than the last. Luther Kane sat at his usual table in the back, listening with a faint, amused smile. He saw not a scandal, but an opportunity, a lever to pry the Whitmore family from their land. When a distraught and furious Caleb Whitmore stormed into the saloon, Kane was ready. He flagged him over, gesturing to an empty chair. "Caleb, my boy, you look like you've seen a ghost. Let me buy you a whiskey." Caleb slumped into the chair. Downing the drink, Kane slid in front of him in one gulp. "They're all talking," he seethed, "laughing at me." "Small people have small minds," Kane said smoothly, pouring another drink. "But a man of property, a man with a name to protect, he cannot afford to be made a fool of. It's a question of honor." "She swore nothing happened," Caleb muttered into his glass. "And I'm sure she's a fine, honest girl," Kane said, his voice laced with false sincerity. "But it's not about what happened. It's about what people will always believe happened. That stain doesn't wash out. It gets on the family. It gets on the land. He leaned in closer, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. You can't marry her now. It would make you a laughingstock. The bank in Austin will hear about this. They'll see the family as unstable, weakened. They'll call in the note. My note. He let that sink in before delivering the final, calculated blow. Perhaps this is a blessing in disguise, a chance for a fresh start. You're a young man. This town, this land, it's tied to this embarrassment now. But I could take it off your hands, give you a good price, enough to go anywhere, be anyone. Leave this whole sorry mess behind you. Cain sat back, watching the poison do its work. He saw the conflict in Caleb's eyes, the flicker of family duty warring with wounded pride and the seductive whisper of an easy way out. The boy was weak. Cain knew he would break. The whole valley was now within his grasp, all thanks to a simple gust of wind. The rumors clung to Dustwood like the red dust itself, settling in corners and coloring every conversation. For Eliza Whitmore, they were a constant, suffocating presence. At home, she faced Caleb's simmering resentment and her parents' anxious, pleading eyes. In town, she endured the whispers that stopped when she passed and the stares that felt like physical blows. Her world had become a prison of perception, and she was an inmate judged guilty without a trial. Her only reprieve was the small, forgotten stable and the company of little cowboy. But then, he too began to fail. It started with a listlessness, a refusal of the precious water she carried to him. Soon, the telltale signs of dysentery appeared, a sickness that could burn through a young foal like a prairie fire. A veterinarian was a 2-day ride away, and a cost the Whitmores could not afford. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to take hold of her, but she pushed it down, replacing it with a focused calm. This was not a matter of honor or reputation. This was a life she had promised to protect. She fell back on the knowledge passed down from her grandmother, a woman who believed the cure for most ills grew from the earth itself. Eliza searched the dry creek bed and the hardy plants at the base of the mesas, her eyes sharp, her hands sure. She gathered yarrow to staunch the bleeding, slippery elm bark to soothe the gut, and the bitter leaves of a plant the old-timers called feverweed. Back in the stable, she worked tirelessly, crushing the herbs with a stone, mixing them with a trickle of clean water from the house well to make a drench. Getting the medicine into the foal was a battle of wills. He was weak, scared, and in pain. She did not force him. Instead, she sat with him for hours on the straw, speaking in a low, constant murmur, stroking his neck until his trembling subsided. She would dip her fingers in the mixture and gently rub it on his gums, a tiny amount at a time, until he swallowed. For 2 days and 2 nights, she barely slept. She was no longer the arranged bride or the subject of scandal. She was simply a healer, fighting a quiet, desperate war in a dusty stable. On the 3rd morning, she arrived to find little cowboy standing on his own wobbly legs, drinking deeply from the water bucket. The relief that washed over her was so profound it left her weak. She sank to her knees and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his coarse mane. She had won. Jack Rowan saw it all from a distance. He had watched her frantic search for herbs, had seen the lantern burning in the old stable all through the night. He saw not a fallen woman, but a fiercely capable one. The sight deepened his own burden of guilt. He had inadvertently helped tarnish the reputation of the most competent person he'd seen in years. Meanwhile, his own small herd of horses was suffering. The drought had made the grazing poor, and several of his animals were plagued by lung fever, their breathing labored and their coats dull. He knew what he had to do. It was a risk, an action that could pour oil on the fire of gossip, but it was the only honorable path he could see. He saddled Dusty and rode not to the edge of his property, but directly up the main path to the Whitmore's front porch. He found Eliza's father, a stooped, worried man named Thomas, inspecting a brittle harness. Caleb was nowhere in sight. Jack dismounted, holding his hat in his hands. "Mr. Whitmore," Jack began, his voice steady, I've come to make a business proposition." Thomas Whitmore looked at him with wary, tired eyes. "We're not selling. Rowan? Not yet." "I'm not here to buy," Jack said. "I'm here to hire. My horses are sick. I saw what your daughter did for that stray foal. I've never seen anything like it. I'd like to offer her a job, caring for my stock." Thomas stared as if Jack had just started speaking in tongues. Just then, Eliza emerged from the house, wiping her hands on an apron. She stopped short when she saw him. Jack turned his attention to her, his gaze direct and respectful. "Miss Whitmore, I would like to hire you. I'll draw up a formal contract, $20 a month, paid in cash, for your expertise. The work would be at my ranch, in the open, for all to see. Your wages could help your family with the bank." The offer hung in the hot, still air. It was audacious, a direct challenge to the whispers. By making it a public, formal arrangement, he was attempting to redefine their association from one of shame to one of professionalism. He was giving her a tool to fight back, and in doing so, trying to repair the damage he had helped cause. That's impossible," Thomas stammered. The talk is based on lies," Jack said, his voice hard. "The best way to fight a lie is with the plain, honest truth. And the truth is, your daughter has a gift, and I need her help. This is a respectable offer of employment, nothing more." Eliza looked from her father's panicked face to Jack's earnest one. Fear warred with a new, unfamiliar feeling, a flicker of empowerment. He wasn't trying to save her. He was acknowledging her skill. He was offering her not charity, but a wage she could earn. It was a chance to be more than a name in a marriage contract, a way to actively contribute to her family's salvation. It was a chance to hold the reins of her own life, if only for a moment. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and strong. Her father looked horrified, but Eliza held his gaze. "Father," she said gently, $20 a month is more than this ranch has seen in a year. My honor is not so fragile that it can be broken by honest work." The next day, she walked over to the bar. The arrangement was tense at first. Jack showed her the sick horses, explaining the symptoms, and then he stepped back, giving her space. He was determined to keep a respectful distance, to ensure there could be no grounds for further speculation. He worked on the far side of the corral, mending tack, sharpening tools, always in sight, but never too close. The silence between them was thick with unspoken things, but it was a silence built of mutual respect, not animosity. Eliza, in turn, focused solely on the animals, her professionalism a shield against any awkwardness. She moved with a quiet confidence, her touch gentle, her voice a soothing balm to the distressed horses. It did not take long for Luther Kane to hear of the new arrangement. He saw it for what it was, an act of defiance. From his perch at the velvet slipper, he decided it was time to tighten the screws. The harassment began subtly. One morning, Jack found a 20-foot section of his northern fence cut, the wires snipped clean. It took him half a day under the brutal sun to round up the 3 steers that had wandered onto Whitmore land and then mend the fence. A few days later, the shallow irrigation ditch he had dug from his spring, the one that carried a precious, life-sustaining trickle of water down to his and the Whitmore stock tanks, was mysteriously dammed with rocks and mud. The water was diverted, spilling uselessly onto the parched earth. It was another day of back-breaking labor to clear it. Then came the drifters. 2 hard-looking men with cruel eyes and lazy smiles rode up to his ranch, claiming to be looking for work. Jack knew better. They were Kane's men. He'd seen them leaving the velvet slipper at odd hours. He told them he wasn't hiring. They didn't leave. They loitered by his corral, making crude remarks just loud enough for Eliza to hear. Their presence a deliberate, menacing stain on the workday. Jack finally walked over, his hands empty but his stance rigid. "I told you to move on," he said, his voice dangerously low. One of the men spit a stream of tobacco juice near Jack's boot. "This is a free country. Mister, we ain't on your land." "You're bothering my employee," Jack said. "That makes it my business. Leave now." The man took a step forward, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. Jack didn't flinch. He just stood his ground, his eyes like chips of granite. For a long moment, the air was tight enough to snap. Finally, the drifter grunted. Seeing something in Jack's face that he didn't want to test, he and his partner mounted their horses and rode off. But Jack knew they would be back. He reported the incidents to Sheriff Boyd, detailing the cut fence, the diverted water, the veiled threats. The sheriff listened patiently, his expression growing more tired with each word. "I believe you, Jack," he said when Jack had finished, "and I know who's behind it. But knowing and proving are two different things. Kane is careful. He uses men who will be 50 miles away by the time I can even ask a question." He picked up the tarnished star from his desk, rubbing his thumb over it. "You have to understand. All I have is this old piece of tin and a law book full of words. The law out here is often just the man with the faster gun and the will to use it. You and the Whitmore girl, you're on your own in this. Be careful." The warning settled heavily on Jack. He was a man who believed in order, in doing things the right way, but he was being pushed into a corner where those things didn't matter. The daily work with Eliza became the calm center of his turbulent life. He found himself watching her, admiring the steady competence of her hands, the quiet determination in her eyes. He felt the frozen ground of his heart begin to thaw in scopic ways, and it terrified him. To feel anything again was to risk the shattering pain of loss. He had buried Martha, and he had sworn he would bury his heart with her. He fought the warmth she brought into his days, holding the reins on his own emotions with a desperate grip, reminding himself that this was just a business arrangement, a debt of honor to be paid. For Eliza, the Rowan Ranch was becoming a sanctuary. In the face of her work, the whispers of the town and Caleb's sullen anger seemed to fade. She was earning her own way, proving her worth in a tangible form. She felt a growing respect for Jack Rowan, a man who met trouble head-on and had offered her a shield of respectable work instead of pity. But each evening, when she returned to the oppressive atmosphere of the Whitmore house, her conflict returned. Her duty to her family demanded she sever this tie, placate Caleb, and restore their fragile peace. But her own integrity, her own burgeoning sense of self, rebelled. She was caught between filial piety and the truth, between the woman she was supposed to be and the woman she was discovering she was. The reins of family and honor pulled one way, while the reins of her own conscience pulled another. And in the distance, she could feel Luther Kane's grip tightening on them all. The fragile truce with Luther Kane's malice was shattered on a moonless night. The air, for once, was still and cool, a welcome break from the oppressive heat of the day. Inside the small bunkhouse, Jack sat with his two hired hands. Silas, a grizzled man with 50 years of Texas baked into his skin, and young Ben, barely a man himself but with a strong back and a loyal heart. A quiet game of cards was underway. The only sounds the soft shuffle of the deck and the clink of a coffee cup. A lantern cast a warm, golden circle of light, a small island of peace in the vast, dark ocean of the plains. The first warning came from Jack's dog, a scruffy mutt named Patch, who let out a low, guttural growl from his spot under the porch. The hair on Jack's arms prickled. Patch was not a frivolous barker. Silas paused with a card halfway to the table, his head cocked, listening. Then it hit them, faint at first, then unmistakable, the acrid smell of smoke where no smoke should be. Jack was on his feet in an instant, kicking his chair back. The hay barn. He burst out the door with the others close behind. The sight that met them was a vision from hell. The large barn where he stored the winter feed wasn't just smoking, it was erupting. Angry orange flames clawed their way up the dry timber walls, roaring as they consumed the packed, tinder-dry hay within. The light of the inferno threw their long, dancing shadows across the ranch yard and illuminated two figures on horseback, already wheeling to flee back into the darkness. Kane's men. But Jack's attention was ripped from the fleeing saboteurs to a movement near the corrals adjacent to the burning barn. It was Eliza. She must have been in her small stable with little Cowboy when the fire started. The heat was already intense, and sparks rained down like malevolent stars. The young horses and calves in the nearby enclosure were screaming in terror, crashing against the wooden rails, their eyes wild. "Eliza, get back!" Jack bellowed, his voice raw with a fear that went deeper than the loss of a barn. She either didn't hear him, or she chose not to. She was already at the corral gate, her hands struggling with the heavy wooden latch. A wave of superheated air billowed from the barn, and she staggered back, shielding her face with her arm. But she didn't run. She lunged forward again, shoving her shoulder into the heavy gate, her small frame straining against it. The latch gave, and she threw the gate wide. "Go, Hiya, go!" she screamed at the panicked animals, her voice high but clear above the roar of the fire. She flapped her arms, a small, determined figure silhouetted against the terrible light, driving the terrified young stock out into the relative safety of the open pasture. While Ben ran for buckets and Silas worked to free the horses from the main stable, Jack sprinted toward the fight he knew was coming. He grabbed a heavy axe handle that was leaning against the bunkhouse wall. The two riders, emboldened by the chaos, had circled back, perhaps to ensure their work was complete. Jack met the first one as he dismounted, swinging the hickory handle in a hard, vicious arc that caught the man in the ribs with a sickening crunch. The man went down, gasping for air. The second rider spurred his horse toward Jack, but Silas was there, appearing out of the smoke with a length of old rope. He flung it with a practiced flick of the wrist, and the loop snagged the rider's arm, pulling him clean off his saddle. The man hit the ground hard. Ben arrived, no longer a boy but a furious man, and the three of them fell upon the saboteurs. It was a short, brutal, and ugly fight, driven by the desperation to protect their home. It ended with the two intruders scrambling back to their horses and vanishing into the night, leaving the ranchers to face the fire alone. Eliza had just herded the last of the calves out when she saw that one creature remained, frozen in terror in the far corner of the corral. Little Cowboy. The fire was louder now, a hungry beast devouring the barn, and the roof was beginning to groan ominously. Without a second's hesitation, Eliza ran back into the enclosure. The heat was a physical thing, stealing the breath from her lungs. She reached the foal, grabbed his halter, and pulled. He wouldn't budge, his small body rigid with fear. "Come on, little one, please," she begged, her voice cracking. She could feel the heat on her back, see the structure of the barn beginning to sag. She put her body against his, pushing, pulling, and finally, his survival instinct broke through the paralysis. He bolted, dragging her along with him. They cleared the gate just as a section of the barn roof collapsed inward with a deafening roar, sending a geyser of embers and smoke into the night sky. For the next hour, they fought the fire. It was a desperate, losing battle against the hay barn, but a vital one to save the other buildings. Jack, Silas, Ben, and now Eliza formed a frantic bucket brigade from the stock tank, their faces blackened with soot, their lungs screaming for clean air. They worked in a grim, synchronized rhythm, their individual fears and differences burned away by the singular, overwhelming need to survive. Eliza worked as hard as any of them, her dress torn and smeared with ash, her arms aching, her face set in a mask of grim determination. Finally, the main fire burned itself out, leaving the barn a blackened, skeletal ruin that hissed and popped in the darkness. They had managed to save the other structures. They stood together in the smoldering yard, exhausted, filthy, and breathing heavily in the smoky air. Silas, the old rancher, walked over to Eliza. He took off his hat, a gesture of profound respect. He looked at the saved animals, then back at her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raspy, "I've seen men, brave men, run from a fire half that size." He shook his head in weary admiration. "You got more grit in you than any 10 men I know. That little herd, they're alive because of you." He paused, then added, "This place, you're the heart of it now." Ben nodded his agreement, his young face streaked with soot and awe. Jack watched them, a profound and complex emotion swelling in his chest. Silas had put words to a truth that had been growing in his own heart. She wasn't just an employee or a woman to whom he owed a debt. She was a partner. She was a warrior. The fire had not destroyed his ranch. It had forged a new and unbreakable bond at its center. The whispers and rumors of the town seemed like petty, meaningless things in the face of her courage. Later, after the horses were calmed and the last embers doused, Jack found her sitting on the edge of his porch, staring at the glowing skeleton of the barn. He brought out 2 mugs of coffee, the steam rising in the cool night air. He handed one to her, and their fingers brushed. The small contact sent a jolt through him. He sat down on the step a respectful distance away. For a long time, they just sat in silence, the quiet punctuated by the hiss of the ruins and the weary chirping of crickets. "Thank you, Eliza," he said finally, his voice low, "for what you did tonight, for the horses, for everything." "They didn't deserve to die in a fire," she said softly, her gaze still fixed on the devastation. "No living thing does." He took a slow sip of his coffee. This wasn't about sick horses or bad grazing anymore. Was it? This was Cain. It wasn't a question. She nodded, a small, tired movement. "He wants us all to break, to run." Jack looked at her profile in the faint starlight, the strength in the set of her jaw, the exhaustion in the slight slump of her shoulders. The walls he had so carefully built around his heart felt like rubble, burned away by the night's events. "When Martha died," he began, the name feeling strange and rusty on his tongue, "I promised myself I wouldn't let anyone get close again. It was safer for me." He looked down at his own calloused hands, clenched around the warm mug. "But that's not living. It's just waiting. And I can't just wait and watch him do this to you. To us." He turned to face her more fully. "The contract, our arrangement, it's not enough. This is more than a job. I know your situation with your family, with Caleb. I know I'm the cause of half your trouble. But I need you to know that this isn't just about my horses anymore. It's about you being safe. It's about all of us seeing this through together." Her eyes, luminous in the dark, finally turned from the fire to meet his. He saw a deep well of sorrow in them, but also a flicker of something else. "Trust. I will protect you," he said, the words feeling more like a sacred vow than a simple statement. "With my life, if I have to, and I give you my word. Eliza, I will always respect you. I will never cross a line you have not drawn." He was offering her not passion, but something far more valuable, a promise of unwavering support and absolute respect for her honor. An honor she had so bravely defended. He was placing the reins of their future interactions firmly in her hands. She held his gaze for a long moment, the unspoken emotions passing between them as clearly as words. She gave a single, slow nod. "I know, Jack," she whispered. And in the quiet darkness of the wounded ranch, surrounded by the ghosts of smoke and the promise of a new day's fight, that was enough. The fire at the Rowan Ranch did not create the division Luther Cain had intended. Instead of shattering the fragile alliance between Jack and Eliza, it had tempered it into something stronger. The whispers in town, which had once been malicious, were now tinged with grudging admiration for the Whitmore girl who had faced down a blaze. Cain realized that petty harassment would no longer suffice. He needed to apply pressure at the source of all power in the Valley Debt. He rode to the county seat and, with a flourish of a pen and a transfer of a significant sum of money, became the sole legal owner of the Whitmore family's mortgage. He now held the deed to their history and the key to their future. His next move was to summon the weakest link in the chain. Caleb Whitmore walked into the back office of the Velvet Slipper with the air of a man heading to his own execution. The saloon was quiet in the late morning, smelling of stale beer and regret. Cain did not rise. He gestured to a leather chair opposite his polished oak desk, a piece of furniture as out of place in dustwood as Cain himself. "Caleb," Cain began, his voice smooth as poured whiskey. "We need to talk about your family's unfortunate financial position." He slid a sheaf of legal documents across the desk. "As of yesterday, I am the bank." Caleb stared at the papers, his face paling. The official stamps, the dense, unforgiving print. It was all there. They were ruined. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Kane steepled his fingers, his expression one of feigned sympathy. "What I want is what's best for everyone. This situation with your cousin, and that widower, Rowan, it's a disgrace. It's dragging your family's good name through the mud. It makes you look weak." He let the word hang in the air. A deliberate, poisoned dart. A man can't build a future on a foundation of ridicule. "What do you want?" Caleb repeated, his voice harder this time. "I want to help you," Kane said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "I am prepared to be very generous. Sign the ranch over to me. I'll forgive the debt entirely and give you a substantial cash sum on top of it. Enough for you and your parents to go anywhere. California, Oregon. Start fresh, with your dignity intact." He leaned forward. "But there is one condition. Eliza must leave Rowan's employ. Immediately, and she must not return." Caleb's head was spinning. It was a devil's bargain sell his heritage to salvage his pride. He felt a surge of useless anger. "Why? Why do you care so much about Rowan's ranch, about her?" Kane gave a low chuckle, as if enjoying a private joke. He seemed to decide that the boy was already a broken tool, and there was no harm in revealing the machine he was a part of. He casually unrolled a large map that was weighted down on the corner of his desk. It was a surveyor's map, marked with precise lines and notations. One bold red line snaked its way directly through the Dustwood Valley. "Progress is coming. Caleb," Kane said, tapping a manicured finger on the red line. "The Texas and Pacific Railway is pushing west. This valley has been selected as the most viable route through the mesas. The land along that line will be worth 10 times what it is today, but the railroad needs a single, consolidated owner to negotiate with, not a patchwork of struggling ranchers." His finger traced a path directly through the heart of the Whitmore property and, more importantly, across Jack Rowan's land, right where his spring was located. Rowan's spring will be the water stop for the steam engines. His land is the key, but your land provides the access. I need both. The scale of it stunned Caleb into silence. This wasn't about a woman or a petty rivalry. It was about a fortune. He looked at Kane's confident, predatory face and saw his own reflection small, trapped and utterly outplayed. He was a pawn in a game he hadn't even known he was playing. In that moment, his resentment toward Jack and Eliza curdled into a bitter self-loathing. He was a victim. Yes, but he was also a willing one. The easy path, the path of retreat, was the only one he had ever known how to take. "Draw up the papers," Caleb said, his voice hollow. "I'll get her to leave." He returned to the ranch and delivered the ultimatum. It was not a discussion. It was a surrender. He laid out Kane's offer to his parents, framing it as their only salvation. When Eliza entered the room, the three of them turned to face her, their expressions a mixture of shame, desperation, and appeal. "Kane will forgive the debt if you quit your job at the Rowan place," her father said, unable to meet her eyes. "It's the only way. Eliza," her mother added, her hands twisting in her apron. "To save the ranch, to save our name." Eliza looked at their faces, at the years of hardship etched into the lines around their eyes. She looked at Caleb, who stared at the floor, a monument to defeated pride. They were asking her to sacrifice her own integrity, the one thing she had fought so hard to reclaim, to save them from a threat she had not created. The weight of her filial duty was immense, but something inside her, forged in the dust of the stable and tempered by the fire, refused to buckle. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "Eliza," her mother gasped. "Listen to me," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "For weeks, I have let other people tell my story. Whispers in town, accusations from my own family, Kane is using my reputation as a weapon against us. If I give in to his demands, if I quit my job under this cloud of suspicion, it is the same as admitting guilt. It means he wins. It means the lie wins. She took a deep breath. I will not let a lie be the thing that takes our home. But what can we do? Her father asked, his voice cracking. He holds the deed. I can tell the truth, she said, not in whispers, but out loud, for everyone to hear. The next day was Sunday. After the morning service, the small community of Dustwood gathered in the town hall for a meeting about the ongoing drought. It was the perfect venue. The whole town was present, packed into the hot, stuffy room. After the formal business was concluded, just as the meeting was about to be adjourned, Eliza Whitmore stood up from her seat in the back row. A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to her. This was unprecedented. A young, unmarried woman did not address the town assembly. Jack, who was standing against the side wall, felt his body tense. Eliza walked slowly to the front of the room, her steps measured and deliberate. She faced the crowd, her hands clasped in front of her, her chin held high. She looked directly at the faces of her neighbors, the merchants, the ranchers, the wives who had whispered about her. My name is Eliza Whitmore, she began, her voice trembling slightly before finding its resolve. And I know what many of you have been saying about me. I have come here today to tell you the truth. She told them everything. She spoke of the night of the dust storm, of her fear for the stray foal, of seeking shelter in the only place she could find. She described Jack Rowan stumbling in, lost and half-blinded by the sand. She spoke of the long night spent on opposite sides of a small stable, waiting for the wind to die. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead for their sympathy. She simply laid out the facts, her honesty a cleansing force in the room thick with suspicion. Nothing improper happened that night, she said, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. Mr. Rowan treated me with nothing but respect. The only sin committed was the sin of circumstance. Since that morning, my family has been threatened, and Mr. Rowan's ranch has been sabotaged. His fences have been cut, his water stolen, and his barn burned to the ground. This is not about my honor. This is about a campaign of intimidation designed to drive good people from their land. She looked toward the back, where Luther Kane stood with his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. And we all know who is behind it. A murmur went through the crowd. Her courage was palpable. She had taken their gossip and held it up to the clear, hard light of truth, and it had shriveled. Sheriff Hank Boyd, who had been observing from his chair near the front, slowly rose to his feet. He looked old and tired, but as he spoke, a spark of his long dormant authority seemed to return. Miss Whitmore is right, he said, his voice booming in the silent room. I've been too patient. I've let legalities and a lack of evidence keep me from acting. No more. He turned his gaze on Kane. As of this moment, when I'm opening a formal investigation into the acts of arson, vandalism, and intimidation directed at the Rowan and Whitmore properties, I'm asking anyone with any information to come forward. This town will not be ruled by fear and shadow. It was a declaration of war. The lines were drawn. Jack watched the entire scene unfold with a sense of awe. He had seen Eliza's strength and compassion with the animals. He had witnessed her courage in the face of fire. But now, he saw her as a leader. She had not only defended her own honor, she had defended the very idea of truth in their community. He looked around the room and saw the faces of the other small ranchers, men and women who were just one bad season or one predatory loan away from ruin themselves. He saw their fear, but now he also saw a flicker of hope, a bit of the steel that Eliza had just shown them. In that moment, everything crystallized for him. His quiet quest to be left alone, to nurse his own grief in solitude, was over. It was a selfish and unsustainable peace. He had thought his duty was to protect Eliza, the woman, but he saw now that his real duty was to protect what she stood for. To protect her, he had to protect the community. Her fight was his fight. It was everyone's fight. Luther Kane was not just a threat to his ranch or her reputation. He was a cancer threatening to consume all of Dustwood, and Jack knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he would no longer just be reacting to Kane's attacks. From this day forward, he would be standing with Eliza, ready to fight back. Eliza's public defiance and the sheriff's declaration had turned Dustwood into a powder keg with a dangerously short fuse. Luther Kane, a man who detested public humiliation above all else, was not one to wait for the law to run its slow, methodical course. He had been challenged, his power questioned in the open. For that, there would be a reckoning. He sent a rider with a heavy purse of gold and a simple, brutal message. The response came 2 nights later in the form of 10 silent men on horseback, their faces hard and anonymous in the cold, brilliant light of a full moon. On the Rowan Ranch, an uneasy peace held. They knew an attack was not a possibility, but an inevitability. Sheriff Boyd had ridden out with his deputy, joining Jack, Silas, and Ben. They had spent the day fortifying the ranch, using overturned wagons, stacked feed sacks, and old fence posts to create a makeshift barricade around the main house and the precious stone-lined well that was its heart. The well was the ranch's lifeblood. To lose it was to lose everything. A handful of men from neighboring ranches, their faces grim, had also arrived, bringing their own rifles and a shared understanding that this was a fight for more than just Jack Rowan's land. Eliza had refused to leave. She had moved Little Cowboy into the main stable, then set about turning the ranch house kitchen into a field hospital, with Caleb's mother and 2 of the neighboring ranchers' wives, both older, steady women. She had organized their meager supplies, clean cloths torn into strips for bandages, whiskey for antiseptic, and a large pot of water kept perpetually on the boil. She was the calm, efficient center of a storm she knew was about to break. The first shot came without warning. A rifle cracked from the shadows of the mesas, and a chip of wood exploded from the corner of the porch. The siege had begun. Muzzle flashes began to blossom in the darkness, a deadly constellation surrounding the ranch. The defenders returned fire, their own shots a steady, measured response. The night air, once still and silent, was now filled with the sharp report of rifles, the angry buzz of lead, and the splintering of wood. The fight quickly focused, as Jack knew it would, on the well. It stood in the middle of the yard, a low stone circle that offered the only real cover between the house and the outer darkness. Kane's men were trying to advance, to gain control of that central point, to cut the heart out of the ranch. Jack, crouched behind an overturned buckboard, fired and reloaded with a mechanical calm. His entire world narrowed to the flash of a rifle and the shadow of a moving man. Beside him, Sheriff Boyd aimed his Winchester with the unhurried precision of a man who had done this too many times before, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor in the chaos. Inside the house, Eliza directed her small team. "Mary, more bandages, Mrs. Gable. Keep that water hot." She moved to the window, peering for a split second through a gap in the barricade. She saw the flashes of light, the dark shapes darting between shadows. She felt a profound, sickening fear, not for herself, but for the men outside, for Jack. She pushed it down, converting it into a cold, practical anger. She would not be a damsel in distress, waiting for rescue. She would be a soldier in her own right. "Keep the lanterns low," she ordered. "No easy targets." The battle raged, a brutal stalemate. For every 2 steps the attackers gained, they were driven back 1. A bullet tore through Silas's sleeve, a hot caress that left a bloody furrow on his forearm. Eliza was there when he stumbled back to the house to reload, her hands quick and steady as she cleaned and bound the wound without a word, her eyes meeting his in a shared, grim understanding before he turned and ran back to the fight. One of Kane's men, a wiry opportunist, saw a different path to victory. While the main force kept the defenders pinned down at the well, he slipped around the edge of the fighting toward the largest remaining structure, the granary. It was filled with seed for the next season's planting and feed for the coming months. To burn it would be to cripple the ranch as surely as poisoning the well. He found a rickety ladder leaning against a fence and dragged it toward the building's side, intending to climb to the hayloft window and toss a torch inside. The constant percussive explosions of gunfire had driven the animals in the main stable into a frenzy. Little Cowboy, who had never known anything but Eliza's gentle care, was consumed by a primal terror. With a high-pitched squeal of panic, he kicked his stall door, the wood splintering, and then again, until it burst open. He bolted blindly into the ranch yard, a dark, terrified streak moving through the chaotic landscape of noise and light. The arsonist was halfway up the ladder, a lit, oil-soaked torch in his hand. He was reaching for the window when the foal, running from the demons of the gunfire, crashed headlong into the base of the ladder. The impact was violent. The ladder twisted, throwing the man to the ground with a grunt of pain. The torch flew from his hand, landing in a patch of dusty, bare earth where it sputtered and died. Little Cowboy, his panic unabated, kept running until he found the far corner of a pasture fence, where he stood, trembling uncontrollably. From his position, Jack saw the whole thing: the falling man, the extinguished torch, the small, innocent creature who had just saved their future. The failed arson attempt was a turning point. The attacker, exposed and on the ground, was quickly captured. The momentum of the assault was broken. Sensing the shift, Jack and the sheriff pressed their advantage, their fire becoming more aggressive, more focused. The hired guns were mercenaries, not martyrs. They were being paid to intimidate a rancher, not to die in a pitched battle that was turning against them. A call went up from the darkness, a signal of retreat. Within minutes, the remaining attackers had melted back into the shadows they came from, leaving behind the scent of gunpowder and 2 of their wounded comrades. A heavy, ringing silence fell over the ranch. The fight was over, but the war was not. As Eliza and the other women emerged to tend to the wounded on both sides, a new sound reached them: the thunder of hooves. A dozen riders were approaching, fast. For a heart-stopping moment, they feared a second wave of attack. But then they saw the familiar shapes of their neighbors, the ranchers who had been at the town meeting, riding with rifles held at the ready. They had heard the gunfire from miles away and had come to stand with their own. The community had answered the call. Sheriff Boyd looked at the faces gathered in the moonlight, at the weary but determined men, at the soot-stained but unbroken women. He looked at Jack and Eliza standing side by side near the well. This was his town, and he had almost let it die. "It's done," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a final decision. He turned to Jack. "Get your horse. We're going to town." He looked at the posse of ranchers. "All of you. We're going to finish this tonight." The Velvet Slipper was still lit, an island of defiant decadence in the sleeping town. Luther Kane was at his desk in the back, a glass of brandy in his hand, waiting for news of his victory. The news he got was the splintering crash of his own bat-wing doors as Sheriff Boyd, Jack, and a dozen armed ranchers filed into his saloon. Kane rose slowly, his face a mask of cold fury. "Sheriff, to what do I owe this intrusion?" "Luther Kane." Boyd's voice was like stone. "I'm arresting you for conspiracy, attempted murder, and arson." Kane laughed, a dry, contemptuous sound. "On what grounds? The word of a disgraced girl and a half-broke widower. You have no proof. I have 2 of your hired guns, captured at the Rowan Ranch, who are very eager to testify in exchange for a lighter sentence," the sheriff said, his voice level. "I have a sworn statement from a clerk at the county records office about the pressure you applied to rush the sale of the Whitmore mortgage. And I have this." He threw a piece of paper onto the desk. It was a telegram from the Texas and Pacific Railway headquarters. They confirm their plans for a new route. They also confirm they have never heard of you and have no intention of negotiating land rights with a man who uses hired guns to get what he wants. Kane stared at the telegram, the color draining from his face. His smirk finally faltered. As if on cue, the rest of the town, woken by the commotion, began to gather outside. They filled the street, their faces illuminated by the light spilling from the saloon. They were not an angry mob, but a silent, unified body of witnesses. They stood behind their sheriff. They stood with the Rowans and the Whitmores. Kane looked from the telegram to the stony face of the sheriff, then past him to the crowd of determined faces filling the doorway. He saw that his power, a thing built on secrets and fear, had dissolved in the light of their unity. He was alone. Sheriff Boyd pulled a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt. "It's over, Kane." The sharp, metallic click as the handcuffs locked around Kane's wrists was the loudest sound in the room. It was the sound of a debt being paid, of a community taking back its soul. As the sheriff led him through the silent, watching crowd, the red dust of Dustwood seemed to finally, truly, begin to settle. The dawn that followed the battle was quiet and achingly beautiful, a cruel contrast to the violence of the night. The rising sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard, illuminating the scars of the fight, the splintered wood of the barricades, the dark, spent shell casings glinting in the dirt, the faint, lingering smell of gunpowder on the cool air. The silence was heavy, filled with the weight of what had been lost and what had been saved. Victory did not feel triumphant. It felt like exhaustion. Every muscle in Jack's body screamed in protest, and a deep, bone-weary ache had settled in. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow space that had opened in the community's heart. Silas, the old, grizzled rancher who had been a fixture on the Bar R for as long as Jack could remember, had not survived the night. The wound to his arm, which had seemed manageable in the heat of the battle, had been deeper than they knew. He had bled internally, and in the quiet hours just before sunrise, surrounded by the friends he had fought to protect, he had simply slipped away. They buried him 2 days later on a small hill overlooking the ranch, a spot he had always favored for its view of the setting sun. The entire town of Dustwood came. It was not a formal, somber affair with a preacher droning on about sin and salvation. It was a gathering of neighbors, their faces etched with shared grief and a newfound solidarity. Thomas Whitmore, his stooped shoulders seeming a little straighter, said a few words about Silas's quiet strength and unwavering loyalty. Ben, his young face looking years older, spoke of the kindness the old man had shown him. Jack stood with Eliza by his side, her presence a silent, steady comfort. He looked out at the faces of his community, seeing not the suspicious gossips of a few weeks ago, but a family forged in fire. They had paid a high price for their peace, a price embodied by the fresh mound of earth at their feet. The red dust of Dustwood had claimed one of its own, a good man, and the loss was a stark reminder that even in victory, there is always a cost. Sheriff Boyd brought the news from the county seat a week later. He sat on Jack's repaired porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, looking more at ease than Jack had ever seen him. "It's done," he said, his voice holding a note of finality. Kane's hired guns sang like canaries. Told the judge everything, the arson, the intimidation, the plan to take this valley for pennies on the dollar. That, plus the telegram from the railroad and the bank records. Kane didn't stand a chance. The court's judgment had been swift and decisive. All of Luther Kane's assets, deemed to be the proceeds of a criminal enterprise, were to be seized by the county. This included the Velvet Slipper, a dozen properties in town, and, most importantly, the mortgage note for the Whitmore Ranch. The bank in Austin got a visit from a federal marshal. The sheriff continued with a grimly satisfied smile. When the judge explained to them the legal ramifications of colluding with a man like Kane, they suddenly became very cooperative. "They've offered your family a new loan. Thomas," he said, turning to Eliza's father, who had joined them on the porch. "Fair terms, manageable payments. A fresh start." Thomas Whitmore looked overwhelmed, the relief so immense it seemed to take the last of his strength. He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "Thank you. Sheriff, thank you. Jack." The weight of generations seemed to lift from his shoulders. The Velvet Slipper was shuttered. its gaudy sign a monument to a fallen tyrant. The shadow that had loomed over the valley for so long had finally been banished, but there was still one ghost left to lay to rest. He came the next morning, riding a tired-looking horse, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Caleb Whitmore dismounted in the ranch yard, not with his usual swagger, but with the hesitant steps of a penitent. He found Eliza near the corral, tending to little Cowboy, who was now her constant, trusting shadow. "Eliza," he began, his voice rough. He stopped a few feet away, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. There's nothing I can say that will fix what I did. I was a coward, I was weak, and I let my pride get the better of my sense. Cain played me like a fiddle, but I let him. I wanted to believe his lies because it was easier than facing the truth." He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. There was no anger left in them, only a deep, hollow shame. He offered me an easy way out, and I almost took it. I almost sold our home, our history, just to soothe my own wounded pride. You were brave. You stood up and fought, while I was ready to run. He shook his head slowly. I don't deserve to be a part of what you're all building here. Eliza listened without interruption, her expression one of sad understanding rather than anger. "Where will you go, Caleb?" she asked quietly. "West," he said with a shrug. "California. Maybe. I've sold my share of the herd to Pa. I need to start over somewhere new, somewhere I'm not me." He took a hesitant step closer. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I am truly sorry for everything." Just then, Jack walked out of the stable, his face unreadable. Caleb stiffened, expecting a confrontation. Instead, Jack just nodded at him. "I heard you were leaving," Jack said. His tone was not accusatory. It was simply a statement of fact. "I am," Caleb replied. He turned to face Jack fully. "Rowan, Jack, I was wrong. I let jealousy make me a fool. You're a good man. You protected her when I didn't. I hope you'll both be happy." He extended his hand. Jack looked at the offered hand, then at Caleb's face. He saw not an enemy, but another victim of Cain's manipulations. A young man who had lost his way and was now trying, however clumsily, to find it again. Jack took his hand and shook it firmly. It was a handshake of closure, an acknowledgement that the past was now truly in the past. Caleb gave a final, sad nod to Eliza, mounted his horse, and rode away without looking back, a solitary figure heading west in search of a second chance. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm established itself. The days grew warmer, and the hard work of rebuilding began. With the help of their neighbors, a new, smaller, more practical barn began to rise from the ashes of the old one on Jack's land. On the Whitmore Ranch, the specter of debt was gone, replaced by a sense of hopeful industry. Jack found himself spending more and more time there, not just as a hired hand's employer, but as a friend and a partner, his advice on cattle and crops sought and valued by Thomas. He and Eliza worked side by side, the awkwardness between them long since replaced by a comfortable, easy companionship. They spoke of horses and weather and the future, their conversations weaving a quiet tapestry of shared understanding. Jack felt his heart, so long dormant and guarded, slowly, tentatively, opening to the light. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the mesas, he found her in the small corn patch they had planted behind her house. The stalks were still young, barely knee-high, but they were a vibrant, defiant green against the red earth, a symbol of the new life they were all cultivating. She was on her knees, carefully pulling weeds from around the base of the delicate plants. He walked up the row and stood for a moment, just watching her. The setting sun caught the light in her hair, turning it to spun gold. She looked up and smiled, a natural, unguarded expression that made his heart ache in a way that was both sweet and terrifying. "The corn's looking good," he said, his voice sounding rougher than he intended. "It is," she agreed, sitting back on her heels. "With a little luck, we'll have a good harvest." He knelt in the dirt in front of her, the scent of the rich earth and the green, growing things filling the air. He took her hands in his. They were calloused and smudged with dirt, the hands of a worker, a healer. They were the most beautiful hands he had ever seen. "Eliza," he began, his heart thumping a steady, heavy rhythm against his ribs. "We've been through more than most. We started as neighbors, became suspects, then allies. And somewhere in all that fighting and fire, you became my friend, my best friend." He looked into her eyes, wanting her to see the absolute sincerity of his words. "I know about your previous arrangement, and I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But I also know that I can't imagine a day on this earth without you by my side." He took a deep breath. "I'm not a poet, and I don't have much to offer. Just a small ranch with a lot of work. A name that's finally clear, and a heart that's, well, it's a bit scarred and rusty, but it's whole again. And it's yours, if you'll have it." He didn't have a ring. He had only the truth. "Eliza Whitmore, I love you. Will you marry me, not to save a ranch or to please a family, but to build a life with me together?" He squeezed her hands gently. "From now on, whatever comes, all the decisions are ours." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of joy, of relief, of a long-held hope finally realized. She didn't speak for a long moment. She simply leaned forward in the soft evening light, between the rows of new, green life, and kissed him. And in that simple, honest gesture, he had his answer. A year can change a landscape, a year of slow, soaking rains, the kind that don't run off in a fury but seep deep into the parched earth, can bring a dead creek back to life. A year of hard work, shared purpose, and quiet trust can turn a collection of frightened individuals into a community. In the year that followed the arrest of Luther Kane, Dustwood was reborn, not in a flash of divine intervention, but through the steady, determined effort of its people. The seasons had turned, and the unforgiving sun of the drought had been replaced by a sky that offered clouds and the promise of relief. The red dust still coated everything. It was the land's signature, and that would never change, but it no longer felt like a judgment. It was just the color of home. The most visible symbol of this transformation stood on the town's main street, the Velvet Slipper. Once a den of shadows and predatory loans, was now the Dustwood Community Hall. The gaudy red velvet had been stripped away, replaced with clean pine boards and whitewashed walls. The long bar where Kane had dispensed whiskey and ruin now held stacks of books and slates. By day, it was a makeshift schoolhouse where a young woman hired from the county seat taught the ranchers' children their letters and sums. On Saturday nights, the desks were pushed back, a fiddle was produced, and the floorboards would thunder with the joyful stomp of dancing feet. It was no longer a place that took from the community. It was a place that gave back. Out at the Rowan Ranch, the changes were just as profound. The well, the epicenter of their desperate battle, was now encased in a new, higher wall of thick river stones, cemented firmly in place. It was more than a well now. It was a fortress, a monument to their stand. The new barn, built with lumber from a dozen different properties, stood strong and proud, its fresh pine scent a clean fragrance of renewal. The ranch was no longer just the bar. An adjoining gate, permanently open, led to the Whitmore pastures. The two ranches were now one sprawling, thriving operation, managed with Jack's quiet foresight and Eliza's intuitive wisdom. Eliza Rowan, now, a year into her marriage, had come into her own. The tentative young woman who had hidden her talents was gone, replaced by a confident matriarch who commanded respect not through force, but through competence and compassion. She was the heart of the unified ranch, her days a whirlwind of activity. She managed the accounts, directed the planting, and oversaw the health of every animal on the combined properties. In a clean, sunlit corner of the new barn, she had established what the locals admiringly called her veterinary station. It was a simple setup, a sturdy table, Shelves of neatly labeled jars filled with dried herbs and salves, and clean cloths, but to the ranchers of the valley, it was a miracle. They brought her their ailing livestock, a horse with the colic, a calf with a fever, a dog with a torn paw. Eliza would work with a calm, focused grace, her hands gentle but sure, her voice a low murmur that soothed both animal and owner. She never asked for payment, but a steady stream of gifts, a sack of potatoes, a jar of preserves, a freshly baked pie was always left on her table, tokens of a community's deep and abiding gratitude. Her constant companion was Little Cowboy. The gangly, terrified foal had grown into a magnificent young horse, his dun coat shining with health, his intelligent eyes missing nothing. He was fiercely loyal, following Eliza everywhere, a living symbol of her ability to nurture and heal. He had become the lead horse of her own string, a creature of the wild who had chosen to stay, a testament to the power of patience and kindness. One evening in late spring, as the setting sun bathed the valley in a soft, golden light, Jack stood on the porch, watching Eliza finish her work for the day. She was talking to Ben, who had become their foreman, gesturing toward a distant pasture where a new herd of cattle grazed peacefully. The easy authority with which she spoke, the respect with which he listened, it filled Jack with a quiet, profound pride that was deeper and more satisfying than any he had ever known. His love for his first wife, Martha, would always be a part of him, a quiet room in his heart that he could visit when he needed to remember. But Eliza had not replaced that love. She had built a whole new house around it, a sprawling, sunlit home with windows open to the future. She saw him watching and smiled, a warm, intimate expression that was meant only for him. She said a final word to Ben and then walked toward the house, her steps light. He met her at the bottom of the porch steps, taking her hand in his. Her hand felt small and strong in his own, a perfect fit. "Walk with me," he asked. "Always," she replied. They didn't speak as they walked, their comfortable silence a language of its own. They ambled past the new barn, past the fortified well, and took the familiar path that led toward the boundary line, the place where they had once been separated by a fence and a world of misunderstanding. They reached the line of cottonwood trees and stopped. A year ago, this spot had been a dry, dusty scar on the land, the creek bed a bleached and stony grave. Now, a new sound filled the air, a gentle, musical burble, a ribbon of clear, cool water, fed by the generous spring rains, flowed over the smooth stones. It was not a torrent, not a raging river, but a steady, life-giving stream. Along its banks, vibrant green shoots of new grass pushed their way through the red earth. They stood on the bank, hand in hand, and watched the water glitter in the last rays of the setting sun. The light caught the ripples, making them dance like scattered diamonds. It was the most beautiful sight Jack had ever seen. "I never thought I'd hear that sound again," he said, his voice low and filled with reverence. He wasn't just talking about the water. He was talking about the sound of hope, of a promise fulfilled. Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder. "The land always remembers how to heal," she said softly. "It just needs a little help." He looked down at her, at the woman who had faced down storms of dust and fire and gossip, the woman who had healed his animals and his heart. He had thought he was protecting her, but the truth was, they had saved each other. They had held the line together, and in doing so, had allowed life to flow back into their world. The red dust would still rise with the wind, and the Texas sun would still be a harsh master. Life in the West would never be easy, but the people of Dustwood had learned something essential in their fight against the drought and the darkness. They had learned that a community is like a well, drawing its strength from a deep, shared source. They had learned that honor is not a fragile thing to be hidden away, but a tool to be used, like a sturdy fence, to protect what is precious. And they had learned that love, true and abiding love, is like water in a dry land, something to be cherished, protected, and shared. For without it, nothing can ever truly grow. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment below where you are listening from so we can all connect. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, like this video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so more people can enjoy this tale.